Alright everybody, let's get into some render settings and getting your first pass basically set up and ready to go. So, starting with the render elements, I know this is kind of where I left off. So I've got these render elements included. I have included two multimats, which I haven't set up object IDs on anything yet, but I have manually set these 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6. Multimats, when you create them, always come in 1, 2, 3, if you didn't know that. So as you create more, you need to keep updating those. So obviously 7, 8, 9 would be your next iteration. So that said, some of these render paths, well, all of these, not all of these, some of these are for doing rebuilding and relighting and so on and so forth in a compositing package and doing compositing for animations and whatnot. A couple of these are also for have like double duty, where they are for working out the grain and resolving issues with your render, and then one of them is strictly this Vray sample rate. That guy is strictly for resolving sampling issues and figuring out what you need to do in your image to help it to get as quick as possible. Hopefully at this point you have watched the Grant Warwick video that I talked to you about, the intro video that I posted. If you have not, stop. Go watch that video. It's half an hour of your life. It's worth doing. And come back to this when you are done. Alright. So you're done watching that video, or you've already watched it. And at this point you will know why, in addition to being able to composite with them, you'll have your GI, your lighting, your reflection, what these passes are doing. Reflection and specular, these guys, if you don't know, they're tied together. This is more like the tight reflections, and when you get into a pretty extreme glossiness, the specular is going to take over, and you'll find that data in the specular channel. You'll also at this point know that the sample rate is in your adaptive here, that is the min and the max. So these are values between blue and red that mediate between what your minimum subdivision is and your maximum subdivision. Okay. So at this point, as we discussed, I like to use quick render, and I've got a scene kind of set up here. My cliff face back here is presently set matte object, and I've got a bunch of stuff turned off. So if I render and don't crash, and another thing I always do when I'm rendering is check out my RAM usage. I want to know what my scene is going to cost. I could turn on pre-calc, and it's going to cost nothing because it's going to render black because I think I turned my lights off. Yes, my lights are not on because I'm brilliant. Yep. Don't. But you'll see in the frame buffer now I've got all of these channels. So if I come back, and one important thing in your global switches, so this guy, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. In your Vray global switches, I know most of you guys are fairly familiar with Vray. So hidden lights, normally, that's interesting. Is that light turned off? Because that was hidden, and hidden lights is checked. Normally I never have this on. That's always unchecked. The next thing I do is probabilistic lights. I turn this off. This is a new feature in Vray, and it's meant for scenes where you have tons and tons of lights, and this will basically limit what it's going to calculate. The other thing that I turn off is use Embry. So this is on the settings tab, use Embry, and then make sure you set your dynamic memory limit to about half what your actual memory on your machine is. You can go 32 or something like that as well, but somewhere in that vicinity. Next, dynamic splitting. I've been turning that off as well. We had a couple of issues with that, so better safe than sorry. Bucket size, normally I set this at maximum about 32. In the old days, you wanted your bucket size smaller, and dynamic splitting is meant to kind of mitigate that issue, because basically you would have it rendering, it render, and you'd get to the last bucket, and you might have one bucket kind of hanging there, and it's waiting and waiting and waiting. So you would set your bucket size smaller so it eats it up slower, and when you get to those final buckets, it would actually render slightly faster. So with dynamic splitting on, basically it's managing your bucket size. You can tell it like a maximum, but then once it gets down to the little nitty-gritty tidbits at the end, it'll break into very, very small buckets. So cool feature. I would like to use it, but seems to have issues. Embry, also this build in particular, this is an older build, so I don't know how well this is going to behave. I know especially Xmesh and Frost, this had some pretty serious issues how they were implementing Embry, so I'm not using it at the moment. Otherwise, we went over probabilistic lights. That's another new feature. The image sampler, another one here, is this progressive renderer. That's actually pretty cool if you wanted to play with it. It's kind of like RT, except for it's not real time, but it gives you that like grain that's slowly building, and then you can give it a max timeout time or a max subdivision that you want it to reach, and it'll kind of one or the other, whichever comes first. Either it will finish rendering in 5 minutes, or it will resolve the image up to the subdivisions that you've given it. So that said, let me check my light. Make sure it's on. Is there nothing in this layer? No, because my lights are turned. Jesus. It's on. Let's make sure lights aren't hidden. Okay, so we should be getting an image, unless I have some sort of override on here, which might be possible. I might have set this up before, or that render element screw up that my machine did might have set some goofy stuff on my box. When those things go down, it can cause issues. So everything looks happy. Let's try this again. There we go, it's doing something. Interesting that it rendered even with hidden lights checked. Normally, the reason why I always have that unchecked is because we'll have lots of different types of lights. As I talked about in the live session, we'll have little lights as like kickers and stuff. We have other lights in the scene. Obviously, I want that dome not visible. We'll have other lights in the scenes, lights for options, lights for other passes, and you don't want all of those lights rendering in every single pass. Okay, so this guy is going, cruising. So if we look at the sample rate, I'm okay. It's not fantastic. Obviously, this edge should be resolved. I'd want, this is quite a bit of green going on in here, right? The other things to look at too, as you've learned, are the reflection channel here, your lighting pass here, and your GI, which, hello. Oh, it's thinking. Okay, so GI, lighting, which would look something like that, and our reflection. And it could be also that you want to look at refraction. You could have some noise in the refraction. That's not going to normally be as problematic. Normally you'll run into like a cutoff threshold type issues, things like that. And then specular, this is going to be like very soft, glossy areas of your shaders. So don't forget about that one. I know in that video, the stuff that he's showing is mostly looking at, you know, reflection, but this is not to be overlooked. So real quick, I might bring this down now. Some things, as I talked about, and I believe Warwick talks about them as well. This guy, your adaptive, this is controlling your motion blur and your depth of field and your edging, so how these guys are resolved. So you want enough that if your camera's moving around or you have a heavy depth of field, that it resolves for that. Then in tandem with that, you've got your DMC, which this guy solves faster. All like the, you know, what it does very quickly. So the lighting, reflection, GI, shader-based things, that's what your DMC is going to do. And you don't really have any control over it. I know there's this fly out here, this global DMC. Generally, we keep this adaptive amount at about 0.85. The noise threshold, this is controlling my contrast tolerance. You can also use, a lot of guys also use this color threshold, basically doing the same thing. You can roll with it. However, I have always used this. Blur uses this. So, to my knowledge, they're pretty much doing the same thing. If they're doing something different, it's like a subtle amount, because generally you end up with like the exact same settings in this noise threshold as you would in this color threshold. The big thing though is you're not controlling your DMC on the render tab. You're controlling that, as Warwick went over, in your sampling of your lights, in the sampling of your GI, so what you set your brute force or irradiance or photon, whatever. Another thing, I most of the time will use brute force and light cache. I do every once in a while use irradiance, never photon. But a lot of times I'll run brute force and light cache. I'll every once in a while bake light cache passes, but for animations that can get unruly and tricky sometimes, especially when you have characters running around interacting with the environment, changing the shadows, doing all sorts of goofy stuff. So not to say that we don't, we certainly do use that. So to start, if I want, I know, you know, Grant normally talks about, you know, gits, and another friend of mine, Akin, who I'm hoping to have lined up for you guys for a guest speaker. He'll kind of talk about some of this stuff as well, but generally we'll dial in a min and a max. But this is also going to be directly related to the subdivisions that you have in your lights. So let's say right now, like I render again, I haven't changed anything. My min is still 1, my max is still 8, right? And all I've changed is my subdivisions in my light. So you'll see a lot less green, right? So this is good. That means the DMC is working more in these areas than the AA. You know, where it's red, that's your image sampler working, and it doesn't solve well for reflection. So you want to keep it working on the edges, on motion blur, areas of contrast. You want to let your DMC run reflection and GI and lighting, so on and so forth, okay? And we can look at my lighting pass. The next thing to do is kind of, evaluate on a pass-by-pass basis. Once you start getting into this, like, all right, how are we looking as far as noise? Once I start tweaking one value, I kind of isolate that channel and keep going from there. So, and a lot of this, it's nice to watch it on a sphere and stuff, but it really comes to a head once you start to have a more complicated scene, and this is where sometimes you'll make some compromises, and everything is not totally perfect. Sometimes you have to compromise for time in order to get it out. Also, this min and max with heavy depth of field, you'll end up like with just ridiculous values in order to solve for that motion blur, things like that. So animation and stills are different. I might crank this just a little bit more, but the principles are still the same. Right now I'm at 200%, obviously, so there's going to be some grain or noise, but you can you'll see it change subtly, and I'm not going to spend like the time that I would honing this guy in, but I want you guys to see like this is the process, and it's kind of a one-step thing, looking back at your lighting and then going back to the sample rate, checking that out. And obviously this is a highly reflective surface, so in order to get this a little bit more blue, which already upping the lighting is doing, I'm going to need to raise the subdivision amount on that shader, which I think is actually set at 20. But this kind of becomes like a little teeter-totter of messing with bringing these values up, and then if your render time starts to go up, you can bring this back up. Your max is basically a divider of your DMC subdivisions. So let's go into the shader. Just the shader I was looking for. This guy, water surface. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of cover. Oh no, he's at 8. What was it? 20? Maybe this one. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna cover a couple of things here first. Let's set him at, 1, 8, so 48. And I normally will never, ever, ever leave this at 1. And also, you don't ever want this to be pure white. 255, don't do that. Don't let anything be pure white or pure black in your reflection, refractions, your diffuse. Always give some room, but nothing is 100% white. It can also give some really bad results. You'll create some crazy noise that you will really have some difficulty getting rid of if you have these pure white values, so don't do that. This is a water shader that I worked on for this particular guy. Sometimes I will put color in the diffuse. A lot of the times my diffuse of the water will also be black. Mostly reflective with a Fresnel checked. The other way to do this is you can put a fall off that's, I've actually normally in the past always worked that way, so I can kind of custom control my fall off. And it's thinking, so I'll use this instead and set this to Fresnel. So what this allows is, I'll bring this guy down just a touch, bring this guy up ever so slightly, like 1. And you can then throw a specific curve on it if you want. But you can also, like, if you were going to do chrome, you just you can tweak, your BRDF way more specifically. But blur generally uses this checkbox. I find some shaders it works really well for. Other types of shaders, especially metals, I never ever use this, and I'll use something like this type of setup. So a Fresnel fall off type. I've also seen like perpendicular parallel, and then a lot of tweaking in the in the curve for that. I think that Warwick has a video that he goes through, and he likes to use this perpendicular parallel. Well, I've only seen one of his videos, so I can't speak to what he likes to do all the time. But in that particular one, he's using that, and as I recall, it's a little rusty truck and stuff like that. And that's way, either one of these, especially if you're going to tweak this guy, you can kind of get whatever look you're going for, is going to be way more applicable to metal than checking this box here. In this case, for water, this can be fine. Just using a standard Fresnel. IOR, I'm just controlling it in the refraction, so it's locked. 1.2 is pretty typical for water, but you can obviously tweak that to taste. And then I'm using a fog color to drive that. I never use, well, not never, but I don't know, probably 97% of the time I do not use refraction color or set a color in my refraction. I just use this to set the refraction amount, and then if I want it to be colored, I use fog color. This is more physically accurate, and it more relates to the thickness of objects, and like I think there's an example out there where they show a vase, and it's probably the best way to illustrate fog color. But as the vase becomes more wider at the base, you lose some of that color, and when it's thinner or kind of more condensed, you get a higher concentration of the color, and that is a more physically accurate way to go about it. So then the fog multiplier, this sometimes depending on the shader and the scale and what's kind of going on, this number can be something as low as 0.007, 0.1, 0.2, and then the fog bias, that's going to control, what is that one again? That's how quickly it goes to black, as I recall. Because ultimately this is going to kind of roll into black, and if this number can go like 80, it can go negative 80, depending again on the scale and the look that you're wanting to get. I would suggest if you're going to start using fog color, look it up. Really every time I use it, I kind of do research again on it, because it's one of those things, it's like, what was this exactly doing again? But I use it enough that at this point I kind of have some numbers that I like to just dial in. That's about it on this. Oh yeah, and then on the water, a little noise. And I know there was a question today in the live session as far as composites and bumps, and yes, absolutely, and I said that at the time, but this is a time when I will do this as well. Yes, I want to keep the old. So water, you'll have like big kind of ripples, and then you also will have like smaller frequency stuff that so that is kind of like within that larger frequency. So sometimes I'll copy it, add it over top of itself, maybe rotate it slightly, and tweak the values, maybe make it a little bit more stupid thing, a little bit more contrast in it. and you know, kind of to taste. And is it average? Yeah. Average will do the best here. As far as like getting more accurately kind of what you were going for. Now you might want to kind of, you know, dial this guy down. Normally I will, but that's kind of how I'll do a bump on a water. If I don't have to, I'm not going to displace it. Obviously, because the displacement can take more time, especially in an animation. If you want it to be rippling, you're not going to be pre-calcing that. You're doing that on the fly. But for something like this, this would be totally fine. Just a little bump, and that's water. It's actually pretty simple. You can throw a little glossiness in the refraction. Fog color will kind of help you fake that a little bit, and you know, anytime you do this, obviously you want to do it very sparingly. Like 0.96 is going to increase your render time, and it's also actually a pretty significant difference from like 0.97. So when I do use these, I'm pretty sparing with that amount. So let's do another render here and see what we get in the sample rate with that 48. And one thing when you're using quick render, note down here, half light cache. So that could have implications on your GI and will when you get down to it. So once you go to clean your GI, you're going to want to not half your light cache. So now we can see the DMC sampler is definitely going to work here on that area, which is good. That's what you want it to do. And I haven't been really, honestly, paying attention to times. At the moment, this is pretty fast, and I don't have final samples or final settings quite yet. Although we're not far off. Once you start cleaning this, once you start like setting stuff in the shaders, it's really, you're not relying on the min and max to clean your image anymore. You're relying on the DMC and the shaders themselves to clean it. It's maybe for some of you a very different way of working. I know, you know, my architectural background, this is more like what we did. And then once I got into more like advertising and film type things, it was more of a, I don't know if you guys have seen the Christopher Nichols videos, but there was definitely like, you know, this like 1 in 100 0.007 where you're working in large production pipelines and you kind of want to have streamlined solutions for things. You end up in these scenarios where 1 in 100 or 2 in 36, and it's just kind of gospel as opposed to going through, and you don't need something at 1 in 24 or 1 in 36 in order to get it clean. You can actually address the noise where the noise is at and get, you know, a nice and speedy image. So, and again, you know, I'm at 200%. So if I was, you know, zoomed back, it's starting to be clean. And let's see, lighting. So we're obviously not going to get any lighting on the water. It's going to be all reflection and refraction. So this is, in addition to compositing, this is what you're going to be using these channels for. They're not just in here to use in Nuke. These are tools to speed up your render and to get things clean. So, but once you have them clean, and sometimes that comes with a cost, like you might, well, 48's just not quite doing it, and let's do a couple of things here. And it is also okay if you have like a value of 128, if that's what it took to clean it, that's fine. There's no, I've seen guys like, oh my god, I can't believe you have that value. But if this is 128 and this is 24, this basically like turns into 12 or 8. It's nothing, like, because this is actually dividing this number. So this and this are working kind of against each other. So the higher you bring this, the higher you need to bring this to compensate. If you set this and you get stuff clean and then you bring this up, you know, this can help to speed up your image. It's kind of, it might be a little bit counterintuitive, but if I start bringing this number up and things are getting slow, bringing up my AA is actually going to help to speed it up a little bit. So it becomes this balance of, all right, what do I need? Because you might have to, right from the get-go, you've got a lot of depth of field. You're gonna rock out 1 in 24. Like, that's just what's gonna happen. So once you're there, that has a consequence on what your subdivisions are going to be in your lights and your shaders and all of those things. If you have to have this because of motion blur and depth of field, then this number could be 248, and it'd be fine. It's not going to negatively affect your render times unless you don't know what you're doing. If you're setting this at like 2048 and, you know, being all crazy, that, you know, that could have an implication. But just know, like, these two guys are kind of wed together. So I have this guy at 64. But I might, in this case, for this, first I wanted to, and then I want 100%. I don't want half light cache anymore. But I'm still overriding samples here, so the other thing to know, or I'm letting quick render do its thing. So at this point I want to override my samples because I want to actually use what I'm going to use. And it's not 89, it's 8. So just by checking this box, now we are running 1 and 8, and my color threshold at the moment is 0.1, which was fairly low. That might be enough. It all depends on the amount of contrast. If this was all like concrete and stuff like that, I've gotten away with like final samples of 0.02, 0.03, and everything being hunky-dory. This, I think, was 1 in 12, this 0.03, and then tweaking all of my settings in my GI and lights and reflections, and it was clean. It was, you know, super smooth. So if somebody's told you, you know, like, this has to be 0.07 or 0.05 or whatever, that's just not true. So, and in this case, I'm using noise threshold, so I'm just going to use it over here as well. Okay, so now I'm overriding my samples. I'm just isolating this one area, and I'm going to bring this up to 64 as well. Oh, and because I'm going to change the scale of my render, well, I'll just adjust once it's going to mess up my region. I'm going to render nothing. Yep. That was fast. How to make your rendering the fastest. Render nothing, and it will be super quick. Alright. Let's come back down here. Come on. Alright. And this is also important. Don't do test frames to get your stuff clean doing the entire thing, unless you really want to waste a whole bunch of your time. I generally work in like areas that I know are going to be trouble, and get those clean, and just isolate that, and then try and resolve the whole image. So now we'll see, this is, it's rendering for real now. Before, it wasn't actually using these min and max values, it wasn't using the noise, or it was using the color threshold that was set, but it wasn't using those min and max in tandem with the DMC. So now we're actually using those, and we're going to see more realistic what the time is going to be. How long should a frame take, you ask? That's not a easily answered question. It kind of depends what's going on. Generally, at Blur, we try to keep things under 3 hours. That's sometimes rendering HD, sometimes rendering down-resed, and then we will up-res after the fact. Most of the time, we're rendering full HD though, but that's something that we aspire to, is to try to keep things down that low. Things that we'll do to speed things up when we can, we will use projections and kind of reproject our images and environments that we've built onto cards and simple geometry, so that we can render an overscanned still, project that onto sometimes the geo itself or rough geo, and then render. Basically, you're rendering your original rendering projected onto the geo, and that gives you obviously very fast renderings. You have a one-time payment up front to render that overscanned still, but after that, then you're iterating really quick. You can render it, or the way I like to do it is set it up as a projection inside of Fusion or Nuke, wherever it is that you want, so that you can quickly make changes and updates inside of your compositing package. I generally try to get to comp as quick as I possibly can. I know, like, Blur, we definitely do a lot of things in camera out of Max, and rely much less on compositing than maybe other studios. That said, I'm kind of trained in compositing, so I rely on that maybe more heavily than some at Blur, not to say at other places. So it's looking fairly clean, and these reds on these edges, like, that's okay, where there's like little blades sticking up. Grass and whatnot, vegetation can take more samples to resolve, and it might be that 12 is not quite enough, or 8 I think I'm rolling with. Yeah, 8. Little blades of grass, things like that, lots of plants and trees. Generally, they can require more max subdivisions. But the reflection is looking fairly clean. That's kind of noisy over there. We'd want to adjust that one shader. This guy's looking probably like he's going to be okay at 64. But if I up this to 12 to try to compensate in my AA, then I'm going to want to bring that number up again. And I think we've just got noise and lighting. Might be in my refraction. I probably want to bring up my refraction subdivisions here, and also simultaneously double check my my bounces on that. Make sure I've got enough. but we're getting fairly clean. And we don't need to watch this whole thing. Come back to me. Okay, so some other things. As I said, I would up my refraction subdivisions here at this point. I might go up to 24, and my max depth on both of these 9. It's probably enough. Yeah, probably in both of these, because it is just a single plane over another plane, and then there's a bitmap underneath. I can show you this like setup for you guys doing the pools. It's, I mean, as simple as it comes. So I've got, let's close some stuff. Move this. A plane over another plane that I've just added some turbo smooths, noises, and then UV mapped it to put like a pebble texture on it, and that's about it. So, that being said, I just wanted to cover. So we talked about the V-Ray frame buffer. I generally use it. Blur at the moment does not. That will change. Hidden lights you want checked off. You can control whether or not you want like reflection and whatnot with these. Sometimes when you're doing test renders and trying to really like isolate one thing, it can be useful to turn off reflections just globally. It'll help speed things up, and then you can also really hone what it is that's giving you the issue. We pretty much always use adaptive. This min shade rate can be very useful. I'm going to come back to this. It's basically compensating in your DMC if you are not getting enough samples in one of your materials or in your lighting or whatever. You can up this guy and it will give you more DMC samples globally, as opposed to having to go in and like, I'm going to tweak this one shader, tweak that one shader. This way you could kind of say, I want this to be 32, and this is going to give you 32 across the board in everything. So it can be useful, but it's not something that you want to be using all the time. I know some people use these for the lighting and reflection and all of that stuff. I generally tend not to. I use the V-Ray dome and then set stuff up that way. Color mapping, we kind of split between linear and Reinhard. There is a video out there. I'll try to post it where he talks about this a little bit. And I think actually by default, V-Ray will start with Reinhard now. I don't know. We have our own like default setup at Blur, but that I heard something like that. Maybe you guys can confirm whether or not that's true. 2.2, we do sub-pixel map, and we clamp generally somewhere around 5 or 10. Linear workflow. Yep, as I talked about, brute force we use for the glossy rays, and retrace and pre-filtering, we will do that. All of this, like, I'm just kind of going over the things that we will do and that we use. Like, I'm not going, this is not a video on like, and this is what the adaptive does. There are tons of those out there if you happen to need that. If you do, let me know. I will point you in the right direction. I'm not going to go over every single thing in here because of the nature of this course. You know, it's kind of implied that you guys should know most of this. If you don't, let me know, and I can hook you up with the appropriate information. So, yeah, low thread priority. You will eventually want this on when we get into volumes and rendering fog. And we talked about all of these, naming your multimats. I know I talked about in the previous video shader-based multimats or material-based multimats as opposed to object-based multimats, and how to set those up. With that, you should be good. Oh, of course. So, the expectation for this week, you guys are going to do first pass. So what does that mean? First pass, generally for us, we do not have displacement turned on, so we'll turn that off. We're not rendering hair and fur and stuff like that. We are rendering, full lighting and whatnot, and we're rendering at lower samples. Your min and max will stay the same, so this can always be what it's going to be. Once you get it dialed in for your scene, and this is not like I couldn't tell you, you're going to need a 24. I can't tell you that. It's kind of scene dependent, and you're going to have to dial that in. But once you get that dialed in, you can then control how quick your render is going to be by adjusting this noise threshold. So a higher value, like 0.8 or 0.9 or 0.1, these are going to be quick frames. And then 0.007, that's going to be slower, more refined frame. So for first pass, for you guys, I would say that somewhere between 0.05 and 0.08 is where you should be. And do something that doesn't have too much grain, that it can't be critiqued, basically. So if you can get away with 0.08 and you get a faster render because you've dialed everything else in your shaders and your subdivisions and everything, you might be able to do that. That's totally fine. If you can't, though, and you need this a little bit lower, set up a 0.05 in your DMC for your noise threshold. Same thing, if you want to use color threshold, same numbers are going to apply. 0.05 right there. Your GI settings, you can get those set up if you want to run. Sometimes we'll, for first pass, we'll do this at 500 instead. I generally don't find I need to go much over 1,000 every once in a while, but it's pretty uncommon, actually. And also, when we're doing an animation at first pass, we will run first, middle, last of the animation sequence, and then we'll do we'll render on fives, so first, middle, last, and then all the five, incrementing every fifth frame in between. And that would be kind of the first thing that we look at. The other expectation is that, we've kind of gone over all the set dressing things and all of that stuff, using Debris Maker, using Grow Effects, all of that. So at this point, you should be placing things in frame that are compositionally pleasing, not just kind of randomly scattering stuff about, which, you can do to a point, like back here, or you get like clumps of stuff like off in the distance of your environment. But begin to like hand place things that are going to kind of add to the framing and help to tell the story of your shot. That's part of scene assembly as well. In that first pass, it's getting your lighting locked down. So get domes. You can use HDRs. You can use a V-Ray Sun. You can use a V-Ray Sun in tandem. For this image, I just used plain old HDR. A lot of the times we'll get away with an HDRI and a sun in the same location as the HDRI. I'm trusting that you guys know how to use a V-Ray Sun and what to do with it. Lighting is a whole other topic that I'm going to kind of gloss over. If it needs to become something more, let me know and we can discuss. Maybe I'll do a quick video on it, but simpler is better. Try to get away with as simple as possible. I think I told the guys in the live session today that generally I will, especially for beginners and when you're just starting out lighting, I'll give like a 3 light limit, and you need to be very conscious of what you're doing with each light. Oftentimes the biggest mistake is somebody will place in tons of lights. They're trying to do this and that and that. They think they're being very deliberate, but really they're just muddying up the shot. So the fewer the better. And if you can make your shot look sick with a single light, that's great. It doesn't make you a bad lighter. You know, you got to rotate that thing. You got to get it placed. You can sometimes I'll place like a negative, like a black card off, and kind of introduce some contrast into the shot. You can bounce light with white cards as well. You don't have to put a light in there. You can actually use geo to bounce light around, and then you know kick it with a HDR or with a V-Ray sun kind of in the same location as the sun in the dome, and you know you're good to go. So with that, I'm going to conclude this video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.